He could be an average tourist in sweltering summertime Washington, joining the throng at the popular Smithsonian Aerospace Museum. But he's more than just a face in the crowd. He's a pioneer in science whose work is commemorated here. He has the unusual name of Grote Reber, and for what he's done, he's been described as being somewhere between Albert Einstein and the Wright brothers.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, Cosmic Awakening, an exciting venture into outer space, will begin in the Albert Einstein Spacerium in 15 minutes.
The Milky Way had been literally broadcasting solutions to its mysteries throughout all time. Karl Jansky, a research physicist for Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, was looking for sources of troublesome radio static in 1932 when he discovered some of it came from the direction of the center of the galaxy. Surprisingly, the discovery was treated as little more than a curiosity by nearly everyone except Jansky and an engineer in Wheaton, Illinois, Grote Reber. In true pioneer fashion, Reber built the first radio telescope almost single-handedly and completely with his own funds. He made the first radio map of our galaxy, showing greatest intensity of radiation toward the center. This radiation emanated from the clouds of dust and gas within the Milky Way. The radio telescope became an important companion to the optical telescope, and the very clouds which thwarted optical astronomers became the prime interest of radio astronomers.
You get to meet all sorts of historic monuments at the Smithsonian.
Superman. My name is Reber.
How are you?
Very good. This is the first time I've been to this institution, and I've had a fine time.
Have you been to Washington before?
Yes, I have. But quite some years ago.
Why did you leave, when you did leave?
Well, when I was here, I worked out on Connecticut Avenue with the National Bureau of Standards. We had a director, one Ed Condon. This was during the great Joe McCarthy era. And Ed Condon spent most of his time arguing with Joe, and he didn't pay much attention to what was going on inside the Bureau. So I found greener grass elsewhere at the ends of the earth.
For the past quarter century, virtually forgotten by the latter-day world of science, Grote Reber, the pioneer radio astronomer, has worked here in Tasmania, Australia's southernmost island state. Where sheep mundanely graze, he built a huge antenna array of poles and wires to listen to the radio noise of the cosmos. Contrarily, on different wavelengths to those on which any other radio astronomer was and is working. He calls it the cosmic surf, long wavelength radiation. And he'd deduced a long time ago in Washington that, despite the scoffers, it did exist, and Tasmania would be the best place on Earth to listen to it. Wildcat Astronomer, that he describes himself as, he went where his intuition and analysis pointed him, and further extended the radio window on the universe, which he'd caused to be opened in the first place. his unusual climbing gear, he climbs his tall poles to manually adjust his antenna. His radio telescope, functional for its purpose, lacks the sophistication of the more conventionally recognisable radio telescope, the design of which he conceived more than 40 years ago. All around the world, the big dishes stand today as monuments to the lonely inspiration and persistence of a ham radio operator who would be the world's first radio astronomer.
During the years I was in school, I was an ardent radio amateur addict, but it sort of ran dry, and I looked around for some other interesting things to do. And by that time, I'd gotten some education, so I was interested in things that were higher up in life than just, solder slinging. Consequently, about that time, I read these papers by Carl Jansky at the Bell Telephone Laboratories, demonstrating that he had found, by accident, natural radio waves coming in from space, and that these were associated primarily with the Milky Way. They were natural phenomena like starlight and didn't indicate any extraterrestrial intelligence or anything like that. So I made some inquiries around to see what was being done, and I wrote to Jansky and asked him if he was going to do anything more. And it was pretty evident that nothing more was going to be done by the Bell Laboratories, and Jansky was working on other things at that time. And I wrote to Harlow Shapley at Harvard and a couple of other places. I remember I contacted the people at Caltech to see if anything was going to be done. And these people were all quite aware of Jansky's discoveries. That is, it had been well publicized, not only in the popular press, but in the scientific journals. But nobody was going to do anything. And consequently, it seemed like here was a real good opportunity to do some kind of fundamental science, that it was an open opportunity that nobody else was going to take advantage of, so why not me?
Carl Jansky's original antenna, here reconstructed at the National Radio Observatory in Greenbank, West Virginia.
I looked at the equipment Jansky had. It was quite suitable equipment for the purpose intended, that is, determining the direction of arrival of shortwave atmospherics. It scanned around the horizon once in 20 minutes. But for the purposes of doing astronomical studies, this didn't have any merit. Furthermore, it was a set of wires on a movable platform, and he had to operate at one wavelength. There was no selection of frequencies available. So, after considering all these matters, it seemed as though some new approach to antenna design or collector should be made.
And so, he came up with the idea of the parabolic antenna, or dish, and built it in his backyard in Wheaton, Illinois.
The idea of a parabolic mirror has been used for astronomical purposes since the time of Isaac Newton. And peculiarly enough, Newton used a parabolic mirror for the same purpose as I did. That is, in his day, all we had was a simple lens, and this had what's called chromatism in it. That is, a simple lens only focused the light at one wavelength. And Newton didn't see any way of overcoming this with the lens, so he decided to use a parabolic dish which would work at all these wavelengths. So I didn't consult Isaac, but it was pretty obvious that this was the thing to do, to use a parabolic dish which would work at all wavelengths. And the only thing then would have to be changed would be some kind of a black box at the focal point. If I wanted to operate at one wavelength, I put up a black box for that one, another wavelength, a different black box, and so on.
His original dish is now on display at the National Radio Observatory.
All right. They put those clamp bars in the wrong direction. They should be hanging down toward me.
Yeah. Okay, now.
They're slightly heavy on the bottom because there's nothing on top. See, it runs just by one cam.
It's had a checkered career. In the post-war years, it was used to bounce the first radio signals off the moon. Then it lay around for years in pieces, before it was brought to Greenbank and reconstructed by Grote Reber himself. It's since been declared a national monument.
As far as it goes.
He's among admirers here at Greenbank, and he's given the grand tour by the director of this largest of the world's radio astronomy establishments.
Now here as we cross the gate, you see the sign saying that only diesel cars are permitted on the site. And that's not to discourage tourists so much as the fact that ordinary automobile ignitions create a certain amount of radio interference, which makes our observations quite difficult. This is the first telescope that was built on the site, the Howard Tatel 85-foot telescope. It was originally used as a single-dish instrument for sky surveys of bright radio sources. Is now used with two other identical elements as a radio interferometer. This is the 140-foot telescope. It's many years in the building, as you remember, I'm sure.
Yes.
And it was built at a time when people weren't really sure if radio astronomy was going to be a science that was worth supporting or not. And we're coming here up on the 300-foot, which was the second instrument built here at Greenbank, and has now the second or third largest collecting area in the world, but at the time it was built, it was the largest antenna in the world.
Okay, right now we're doing what is known as a scintillation program, and scintillation is similar to when the stars twinkle at night. The atmosphere does that. This is done by the solar atmosphere. Since it's close to noon here, we're looking near the sun and through the solar wind, and this produces a twinkling type effect on a radio source, and we use the particles coming off the sun like a diffraction grating, and it's a fancy way of doing interferometry without another telescope. Really, it's kind of elaborate. And what you just saw when it shot up was a calibration signal. They fire a calibration signal.
That's calibration right there.
Right, they fire that at the beginning of each scan so that they know how strong the source actually is.
I see. So everyone has seen the stars twinkle on a clear night, and what this is radio waves from radio stars twinkling as the radio waves come through the solar atmosphere.
Right, that's correct.
That's very interesting. And from the nature of these twinklings, they can get some idea of the aberrations.
Radio astronomy has indeed become a high-technology science, but it had uneasy beginnings, due largely to the reaction of scientists back in the 1930s to the original observations by the Wildcat Astronomer. These are Grote Reber's first reports on the cosmic static. They're published in the scientific press in 1944, after 5 years of fighting to get them accepted. That early difficulty in recognition left Grote Reber with a somewhat jaundiced view of academic science. Australian astronomer John Bolton.
He's always had a chip on his shoulder as far as the professional scientist is concerned. And no doubt this came from his very early work, which he'd done in Chicago. There he'd built a backyard antenna and a very sensitive receiver. And he used to sit up night after night recording the signals in this receiver on a chart recorder. Now, for most of the 24 hours, all he got were the electrical disturbances from the city, the streetcars and so on. Many thunderstorms and so on, but he would be able to recognize whether a signal was interference from listening in a speaker or earphones. Unfortunately, when he took his chart recordings to Yerkes Observatory, and I got to know later on many of the astronomers there who Grote had talked to, And they simply said, well, what he showed us, these signals from space were only about 100th the size of the general mass of ink on his chart recorder due to all sorts of external disturbances. You can't blame us for throwing cold water on his observations.
See, you have to remember circumstances of that day. Astronomers had been trained in the art of optical observations and for the previous 30 or 40 years or more in photography, and they understood and applied these techniques quite well. But when it came to electronics, most of the astronomers were completely, ignorant. That is, maybe they knew the difference between a volt, an ohm, and an amp, but that was about the limit. That when you start talking about vacuum tubes and tuned circuits and time constants and all that, they were just words. The astronomers didn't have any conception of these matters. And this was somewhat disillusioning in a way.
Grote Reber's hometown, Wheaton, Illinois, near Chicago. He's born here in 1911. But unfortunately, his parents overlooked naming him.
Central European people have the custom of giving the child the mother's maiden surname as a middle name, and then some other Christian name for a first name. So I should have been, say, William Grote Reber. When a new child is due to arrive, there's usually plenty of people around who are going to supply its name long before it's born. But in my case, apparently, everyone was pretty uninterested. And all the birth certificate gives is a date and the hospital and the mother and the father's name, and it testifies that one baby Reber has been born. See, that's all it says. So it could be any old baby running around on the loose. So I'm just Grote Reber, period.
Where the young Grote Reber played and later built his radio telescope is now, ironically, a car park for Bell Telephone.
During the period when I lived here and built and operated my radio telescope, approximately this location from here, maybe about 30, 40 feet back, was where the house I lived in. And to the left, over here in this greensward, was the location where the radio telescope itself was actually constructed. As a matter of fact, it was all prefabricated and laid out on the ground. And so nothing showed. And there was a fence and stuff here. And then one day, we put the whole thing together. And people inquired, where did we get that thing? Where did it come from? Because it was practically all assembled, the structure, in one day. And, it had a number of weird ideas. One was like controlling the weather and for collecting water, because when this thing was parked, there was a big hole in the middle, and when it rained, the water just gushed out in torrents. And then still later, it had some weird things from the newspapers. Feature writers would dream things up. And people had a lot of curiosity about what it was, and there was a lot of local speculation, including some highly imaginative speculation. Now, you have to put yourself back into the times that it was very evident that there was a war brewing in Europe. There was one in progress in Spain, and it was only a question of time before this oncoming war appeared, but nobody knew under what circumstances. It was also very evident that aircraft were going to play a much more important part in this oncoming war than they had in the past. So one of the imaginative explanations of this device which I built was that I had discovered some kind of a death ray that was death for airplane engines. That is, I would point this thing at an airplane, it would put the engine out of commission, and then the airplane would fall down, see? And this gained enough credence to appear in the Daily Journal.
War clouds were building up, and with them, the technology of radar, which would ultimately be the making of radio astronomy. Signals from the heavens were sometimes picked up by the wartime instruments. These, together with the intensive wartime radar effort, would produce a crop of highly trained radio scientists, men like John Bolton, now director of the Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia. He would discover the first radio star using a simple antenna mounted on a cliff top at Dover Heights in Sydney, and also employing the sea as a reflecting surface.
We attempted to find out whether the broad band of radiation which Jansky had discovered and Reber had confirmed could be broken up into individual isolated objects. And we did this by using a very small aerial of extremely low resolution situated on a cliff top. If you do this, you get two signals from any single source, one which comes directly to the aerial and the other which is reflected off the sea. And we did in fact succeed in measuring the positions of three objects sufficiently accurately to identify them with visible counterparts. One of these, the Crab Nebula, is perhaps the most famous astronomical object known, as the Chinese saw it blow up in 1054 AD.
Grote Reber tried to go one better. He built an antenna on a 3-kilometre high volcano in Hawaii. The idea being that, like Bolton, he would use the surrounding sea as an additional collector of cosmic noise. But he went too high, and the curvature of the Earth would distort his results.
Well, I think Grote had read our original discovery papers of these objects, which were published in 1947 and 1948. And he was at the Bureau of Standards in 1949 and generally very unhappy. He'd built receivers for 3 ex-German radar antennas called Würzburgs, and was working a 9-to-5 day under the supervision of the Bureau of Standards, which wasn't really his idea of a good existence. And I first met up with him in 1950, and he told me of his plans to go to Hawaii and repeat the kind of things that I'd done at Dover Heights. I did tell him that, in my opinion, it was extremely doubtful if he'd achieve the objective which he set out to, and but I think he was set on going to Hawaii anyway, and hoped that I was wrong.
The results were not commensurate with the effort, and consequently, I didn't follow it up. It seemed like there must be other things to do. After the war, there was this tremendous development in microwave technology. And so radio astronomy had now not only become respectable, but become popular. And there were radio astronomy observatories being set up at many places around the world. They were practically all working at wavelengths of 1 meter and less to take advantage of this new technology. So there was no point to me embarking on that kind of thing. I concede that science was in good hands, that I should try to do something new and different. And so it seemed wise to try to work at the other end of the spectrum, at the long wave or low frequency end of the spectrum. And this was going to be controlled by the ionosphere, that is this electrical layer high overhead that reflects radio waves back to the Earth. And as I had been working at the Bureau of Standards, and this was the radio division, and they had collected vast amounts of data on the ionosphere. Now this was another, see, science goes in fads, and one of the popular fads of that same era was called ionosonding. That is, measuring the condition, height, and so on of the ionosphere. This was being done at hundreds of places around the world. And most of this data, copies of it were being funneled into Washington. And I had access to this data. So I searched through the data to try to find a place where the ionosphere would be most transparent. And I had observations at Christchurch in New Zealand, Taradeli, that's on the Antarctic continent, Macquarie Island south of here, Townsville, is near Canberra also, and out at Perth, and also Hobart. And examining all these, it was very clear that the ionosphere would be most transparent somewhere around this island of Tasmania.
Why should the ionosphere be transparent over this region?
Well, it's it turns out that it's about halfway between, obviously, low latitudes and high latitudes. In high latitudes, the ionosphere is created to a large extent by particle radiation, auroras, this sort of thing. At low latitudes, by solar radiation. Tasmania is about halfway between, and this results in a trough in the ionospheric density, and hence an increase in its transparency.
So you get sort of holes being formed all around this particular latitude.
It's more like a ring around the south magnetic pole of low density.
But had anybody ever thought of this before Grote Reber got onto it?
No, he discovered this by looking at ionospheric data.
Well, that was fine and beautiful. So I had to make a contact somehow. And I searched through the literature, the science abstracts, and I found a paper by a man named Ellis who discussed some aspects of the ionosphere. At that time, he was in charge of the ionosphere operations here at Hobart. So I wrote to him. He didn't know anything about this, but it sounded like an interesting thing to him, and by good fortune, the ionosphere station had moved from its old position over near about Romney to a new place up on the hill behind the university. But the old place was still in their possession.
Well, we had this observatory with all the equipment. We had receivers. He brought receivers, and as it happened, it was necessary only to connect them all up.
And we were very much surprised and in a measure dumbfounded to find out that on the very first evening, the ionosphere had become transparent, or this hole overhead had opened up about midnight. And it had stayed open, apparently without any ionospheric clouds or any kind of disturbances, until sunrise the next morning, in which case, when the sun came up, the additional electrons were created and the ionospheric hole closed with a snap.
It's possible to see on the top trace the signal increasing just at the left here when the ionosphere opens up during the course of the night at 2 a.m. The signal comes through along here until 6 a.m. At dawn, the sun comes up, shuts off the ionospheric hole, and the signal decreases again.
It's almost like a camera lens.
Yes, it opens out and then shuts up again. More or less circular.
So this very first attempt was successful beyond expectations, and it demonstrated that not only did the phenomena exist at a wavelength 10 times as long as what Jansky had been measuring at, but that it was of unexpected intensity.
It's possible to see in this record here, for example, here we have the evening time, the ionosphere opening. The peak is produced by the external radio galaxy called Centaurus A. After a couple more hours, the Milky Way passes overhead, and you get this very pronounced trough due to absorption of the radiation by the interstellar gas. As the Milky Way passes away, then you get another peak in the signal, and it decreases during the early morning hours until finally it's cut off by the sun rising and shutting off the ionosphere.
One other feature worthwhile mentioning is that this hole is transparent in both directions. If the celestial radio waves can come through the hole and get down to the surface of the Earth, all man-made interference and terrestrial atmospherics go out into space through the hole. So when the hole is open, we don't have any interference. The other two nights, we also got results. That is, the hole opened partially from time to time and opened fully a bit at a time. So all three nights we got something, and the first night was the best. So this definitely showed here was a new and interesting opportunity to do radio astronomy.
In the early 1960s, after a sojourn back in the United States, Grote Reber set up his elaborate antenna array at Bothwell to listen through the ionospheric holes to the cosmic static. It was designed to take advantage of the years when the sun was quiet and the ionosphere less dense, and thus more transparent to the long wavelength noise. In the years since, Grote Reber, Wildcat Astronomer, has spent many lonely vigils with the heavens.
Celestial radiations don't have any particular sounds on them that have intelligent meaning. They sound like a boiling tea kettle or like the surf.
His interpretation of how the cosmic surf is generated is controversial. He believes it's the product of tired light losing energy and changing into a radio waveform. If he's right, it could be that he'll upset the Big Bang theory. What were you looking for at these long wavelengths, though?
Well, nothing really. That is, people get the idea that science is some kind of a rational thing which you form a hypothesis and then you do an experiment to check this hypothesis and then you do a bootstrap operation and move up the line. That's all right if you got somewhere to start, but if you don't have anywhere to start, you just go out and do an experiment to see what you get. In other words, have an open mind. Don't be too dogmatic on what you're going to find, because you may not. You may find something more interesting.
This is part of your philosophy as Wildcat Astronomer.
That's right, see? Don't believe in the current dogma. Cook up your own.
Wildcat Astronomer, or more aptly, Wildcat Scientist. For Grote Reber's impact has by no means been confined to astronomy.
I got here in November '54, and I didn't know much of anybody, and at that time there were still river steamers running, and one day, I guess it was a Saturday, I took a trip on a river steamer down the channel and got off at South Arm, and the captain said he'd be back late in the afternoon and pick me up either at South Arm, or if I wanted to, I could walk up about 3 miles to Possum Bay.
That walk would lead him into the history of the now virtually extinct Tasmanian Aborigines. He would produce the first accurate dates for Aborigine occupation of the island, utilising the then recently invented technique of carbon dating, something he dabbled with in Hawaii before coming to Hobart.
I noticed on the face of this embankment there were a lot of shells, and mixed up in the shells were some carbon. This is obviously a place where the natives had camped and cooked their shellfish. So I thought, all right, why don't I take some of this carbon as a sample just to see, and had them sent to Isotopes Incorporated at Westwood, New Jersey. Well, I sort of expected I might get a date of a few hundred years that the blacks had been camping there. But much to my astonishment, I got a date of 2,080 years. And this, of course, made it much more interesting.
It also revolutionised archaeology in Tasmania. But typically, having started the field, he would leave it to others to develop. Then there's the beans. Yes, beans. At the Hobart headquarters of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, where he has an office, the amazing Grote Reber has conducted experiments showing that runner beans can be made to produce more beans by training them to grow clockwise.
This is a natural way that the beans turn. As you can see, they go round and round and round like that, counterclockwise looking down from the top. Now over here, we have a sample, and I've artificially turned them so they're going the other way, clockwise, like that. And I think I tried this with half a dozen different varieties. And nothing can be deduced out of it if you pick the pods green. But if you let them mature and dry out and turn brown, and then analyze them, you'll find that the ones on the reversed vines, that is these, have a greater weight of beans to shucks, that is this casing, compared to the ones on the normal vines. You can't see it by looking at it, but if you sample them and weigh them, you'll find it always happens irrespective of the variety. And it's a rather significant amount, something like about 25% difference. And we had a gentleman here. What was Frankel? Otto?
Yes.
Otto Frankel. What was he?
He was chief of the plant industry division.
Oh, he was chief of the plant industry division. And Don Martin, who was officer in charge at that time, had him here, and he was in the library. And he summoned me to come in and talk to Otto, and explained to him what I'd done. And Frankel looked at me as though he was looking at a nut. And after I had told him in a few sentences what had done and what had happened, Otto pounds on the table and he says, "It can't be, it shouldn't be, I don't believe it." And so I said, "Well, sir, that's your privilege." And let it go at that.
From his country cottage at Bothwell to Hobart is approximately 100 kilometres, and his weekly commuting has given him a more than passing interest in cars, and has indeed led to his latest preoccupation, which is designing and building an electric car.
Quite a few years ago, it became evident to anybody who'd taken a look at matters that liquid fuels are going to be in short supply. The only question was when, how bad, and what the manifestations were going to be. Now, there are a lot of people who are advocating public transport, but this is for the birds. That is, after people have had private transport, nobody wants public transport. That's silly. Now, the amount of energy available to drive a vehicle using electricity is trivial compared to the energy that can be stored in a tank of petrol. There's a few percent only. And so the performance of any electric vehicle is going to be very much less than any petrol-driven vehicle because the energy simply is not there. Accordingly, if you look at the picture, you'll find that most of the energy in driving the vehicle is used in driving the vehicle and has little, if anything, to do with the payload. There's a 3,000-pound car hauling around a 150-pound man is a pretty ridiculous kind of a contraption. If there was any possibility whatsoever, it was going to have to do with reducing the weight of the vehicle so that the ratio of load to tear, that's vehicle weight, was improved.
Which is just what he's trying to achieve with the remarkable vehicle he's building at an auto shop in Palatine, Illinois. He read about the shop, which specialises in custom-built cars, some 3 years ago, and has been commuting between Tasmania and Illinois ever since to build his car, which he calls Pixie. The hull is from an aluminium canoe. With its sulky wheels, rubber springs, it should weigh in, with batteries, at about 200 kilograms, or 400 pounds. Over the years that his electric car is being built, he takes up summer residence close by and reverts back to a more American lifestyle, enjoying the fact that as a man with two countries, he's able to manage spring and summer in both hemispheres and avoid the winters. Gallatin, Illinois, is not far from his hometown of Wheaton, where he invented the first radio telescope. In a sense, he's come home for his latest invention. Pixie, the car, is still in its developmental stage.
Here it is now, and the trunk lifts like that, and the license plate goes on here. It can be seen through this, and underneath that paper bag, temporary cover, is the controller for determining the speed of the car. This is a demonstration of how the drive mechanism works on the rear wheel. This is the rubber friction roller, which is free from the wheel now. As you can see how easily the wheel spins. Now, what I will do is let the motor down so that the friction wheel is now on the tire. See? And I will apply power temporarily, just direct from the battery, so that it's possible to see how this thing will function. And that is about 50 miles an hour, roughly. And the motor doesn't show any bumpiness. Is the rubber traction wheel and the rubber tire take up all the irregularities.
The next stage will be wind tunnel tests, which the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is offering. Then hopefully Pixie will go back to Tasmania and become, licensing authorities permitting, his regular mode of transport. It will be a novel sight in the 19th century village of Bothwell, which the peripatetic pioneer is finally planning to call home. He'll set down roots here.
Ah, greetings, Mac. You got something saved up for me.
Did you get my message?
Boy, have you. It's been a few days since I've been here.
Added to that message was that the professor said to come in the morning.
Oh, okay.
If not before 2:30.
All right. I'll ring him when I get in there and find out what the score is. Here, with the polarization would be auspicious, and here it would be against it.
Yes, that could be. And there's also interstellar scintillation as well.
With his friend, Professor Bill Ellis, with whom he started his long wavelength radio astronomy in Tasmania, Grote Reber is planning a new adventure in astronomy. New at least to the extent that it will involve the use of the space shuttle. It follows a discovery some years ago that rockets can blast holes in the ionosphere. Just like the naturally occurring holes which Grote Reber discovered, these will permit observations of the radio sky at long wavelengths. The idea is to have the space shuttle come down into ionospheric regions and fire its engines, and thus produce at will holes over various parts of the Earth where there are appropriate astronomical facilities. Hobart is one such location.
Well, I'm in hearty favor of this space shuttle experiment because it gives us an opportunity for man to get one control over one more facet of his environment. For instance, I worked out there at Bothwell the winters of 74, 75, and 76, trying to make observations at 1 megahertz frequency, and it was all for naught because the ionosphere didn't cooperate and become transparent. Now, if a space shuttle was sent over and dumped out whatever it is they dump out, the exhaust gases, then we would have on command a hole in the ionosphere, and I'd only have to go out there when the space shuttle was doing its stuff. It'd be a very much better arrangement. This house is the gardener's cottage on Weathering Estate. And the room we're in is the old-style, rather spacious kitchen. I decided to contract back into the kitchen for my habitation. this leaves the rest of the house open for doing construction work and laboratory operations and storage. This area was originally the lounge and the dining room, and I have converted it into a place for keeping the finished timbers for my new house. This will be a prefabricated job. As you can see, all these pieces are cut and drilled and marked, so it'll be possible to put the whole thing up maybe in as little as a day or so.
My God, it's a regular junk room.
Well, this room is my storage alcove. And all this gear you see here in these boxes is some of my antique radio astronomy stuff. It dates back to the days of Wheaton, Illinois.
What's this one up here on the...
Well, this is the control panel for my earliest receiver from 1938, 1939, and part of 1940. And it was used for measuring the initial successful results on cosmic static that I first got in the spring of 1939. This is the output meter, and what I used to do is sit down there at night and I would read this indication of the pointer on this meter every minute and write it down in the logbook. And then at some days later, when spirit moved me, I would plot these numbers up, and these definitely showed that I had now finally encountered Jansky's radio noise from the sky.
Surely this should be sitting in some museum somewhere rather than the back room of a farmhouse in Tasmania.
Well, probably should. It should be back at Greenbank, West Virginia with my dish. I'm doing these things, partly because I enjoy doing it, and partly I have difficulty finding anybody else interested. So I think I qualify as a jack of all trades and a master of none. Now, there's another philosophical thing here. People have their own pet ideas, and they tend to promote these pet ideas and carry them out to the maximum of their ability. And so when somebody comes with another idea that's different from their pet, it is naturally no good. Because if it were any good, they'd be working on it. So the advice I got was primarily negative. That is, the radio waves that I'm looking for couldn't possibly get through the ionosphere because the electron density would be too high in contrast to the evidence available. If they did get through the ionosphere, there would be great absorption. Even if I could find these greatly attenuated radio waves, I would probably be greatly cursed by man-made station interference. And even if I could find a clear channel, I would probably be drowned out by atmospherics. So the whole thing was hopeless on at least these 4 counts. So after thinking this all over, I came to the rather solid conclusion that this was really a very fertile field of endeavor, because obviously nobody knew anything about it.